The November wind cut through the broken windows of Riverside Children's Home like a knife through cloth. Sarah Mitchell pulled her thin sweater tighter as she counted the meager portions of turkey and potatoes on each plate. 15 children sat around the long wooden table, their eyes bright with forced cheer despite the chill that seemed to seep into their very bones. The old furnace had given its last breath 3 days ago, and the repair bill sat on Sarah's desk like a death sentence. $800 might as well have been $8 million. The home barely scraped by each month, surviving on donations that came less frequently as the economy tightened its grip on their small Montana town. "Miss Sarah, the fire's getting smaller," whispered Tommy, a 7-year-old with gap-toothed smile and eyes too old for his face. He pointed toward the stone fireplace where a few remaining logs struggled to provide warmth for the large common room. Sarah forced a smile and ruffled his sandy hair. "We'll make it last, sweetheart. We always do." But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her stomach. The woodpile outside had dwindled to nothing more than twigs and bark. The local lumber yard had cut off their credit weeks ago, and the charity that usually helped had redirected their funds to flood victims 3 counties over. Margaret O'Brien, the home's cook for 23 years, emerged from the kitchen carrying the last of the cranberry sauce. Her weathered hands shook slightly from the cold, but her Irish accent remained as thick as the day she'd arrived from County Cork. "That's the last of it, then," she announced quietly to Sarah. "The pantry's nearly bare, and the refrigerator's been making sounds like a dying cow. Without proper heat, we'll lose what little food we have left." The children chattered among themselves, comparing their drawings of turkeys and sharing stories about what they were thankful for. Their resilience broke Sarah's heart. These kids had been abandoned, neglected, or orphaned, yet they still found reasons to smile and hope. 12-year-old Maria, the unofficial big sister to the younger ones, helped serve the smaller children while keeping up a steady stream of jokes and funny faces. She'd been at the home for 4 years, ever since her grandmother passed away, and had become Sarah's right hand in managing the chaos of daily life with 15 children. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the temperature inside the building dropped noticeably. The children huddled closer together, sharing blankets and body warmth. Sarah watched them adapt with the practiced ease of kids who had learned early that life rarely offered comfort on a silver platter. The front door creaked in the wind, its old hinges protesting the constant pressure. Sarah made a mental note to add weather stripping to her ever-growing list of repairs they couldn't afford. The list had 3 pages now, written in her careful handwriting and tucked between overdue bills in her desk drawer. After dinner, the children gathered around the dying fire for their traditional Thanksgiving story time. Sarah pulled out a worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit and began to read by the flickering light. The children pressed close, some sitting on the floor, others perched on the edges of chairs, and the old sofa that had seen better decades. As she read about toys becoming real through love, Sarah noticed how the children's breath was beginning to show in small puffs in the cooling air. The fire had burned down to embers, casting dancing shadows on the walls that made the large room feel both cozy and haunted. Young Timothy, barely 5, and the newest arrival at the home, climbed into Sarah's lap during the story. His small body trembled with cold, and she wrapped her cardigan around him, sharing what little warmth she had. His parents had been killed in a car accident just 2 months ago, and he still woke up crying for his mommy most nights. "Miss Sarah," he whispered against her shoulder, "will the fire come back tomorrow?" The innocent question hit her like a physical blow. She kissed the top of his head and whispered back, "I hope so, sweetie. I really hope so." But hope felt as fragile as the dying embers in the fireplace. The local bank had been understanding about late payments before, but their patience was wearing thin. The state inspector was due next week, and if the building wasn't properly heated, they could lose their license to operate. The thought of these children being scattered to different facilities, possibly separated from the only family they'd known, made Sarah's chest tighten with panic. Margaret appeared beside her with a cup of lukewarm tea. The last warmth from the kitchen stove before it, too, had been turned off to conserve what little propane remained in the tank. Her kind eyes held the same worry that kept Sarah awake at night. "The Wilson boy asked me about Christmas today," Margaret said quietly. "Wanted to know if Santa knew where to find him here." Sarah's heart clenched. Christmas was only 4 weeks away, and they had nothing. No money for gifts, barely enough food for daily meals, and now no heat to keep the children warm through the winter nights. After the story ended, and the children reluctantly headed to their dormitories, piling extra blankets on their beds and sharing rooms for warmth, Sarah stood alone in the common room. The fire had died completely, leaving only cold ashes and the smell of smoke. She walked to the large window that overlooked the main road leading into town. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the ground with a thin white layer that would only make heating the building more difficult. In the distance, she could see the warm yellow lights of houses where families sat around dinner tables and cozy fires, taking for granted the simple comfort of warmth. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. 15 children depended on her, trusted her to keep them safe and warm and fed. She'd dedicated her life to this place, using her inheritance from her grandmother to keep it running when state funding fell short. But even that money was gone now, spent on emergency repairs and basic necessities over the past 2 years. A soft knock on the doorframe made her turn. Maria stood there in her pajamas and oversized robe, her dark eyes serious beyond her 12 years. "Miss Sarah, are we going to be okay?" The question every adult dreaded from a child, especially one who had already lost so much. Sarah crossed the room and pulled Maria into a gentle hug. "We're going to figure something out," she said, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "We always do. I heard you and Miss Margaret talking about the inspector coming, and about Christmas." Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't need anything for Christmas, but the little ones still believe, you know?" Sarah's eyes burned with unshed tears. This child, who had every reason to be bitter and demanding, was instead worried about others. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "I know, sweetheart, and they should believe. We'll find a way." As Maria returned to her room, Sarah remained by the window, watching the snow fall more heavily now. Somewhere out there, in a world that seemed increasingly cold and indifferent, there had to be an answer. There had to be someone who could help them through this crisis. The old grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, its deep voice echoing through the now-silent building. Sarah made one final check of the locks and turned off the remaining lights, leaving only the small lamp on her desk burning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight 15 children slept under her roof, trusting that somehow, some way, things would work out. As she climbed the stairs to her small apartment above the common room, Sarah whispered a prayer into the darkness. Not for herself, but for the children who deserved so much more than empty pantries and cold rooms. They deserved the warmth of hope, the comfort of security, and the magic of believing that tomorrow could be better than today. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows and sending snow swirling across the yard. The temperature continued to drop, and somewhere in the building, a pipe creaked ominously. Winter was coming whether they were ready or not, and right now they were far from ready. But in her heart, Sarah held onto a stubborn flame of determination. These children had taught her that miracles could happen in the most ordinary moments. Perhaps tomorrow would bring one of those miracles, unexpected and life-changing. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence and possibility. The morning sun struggled through heavy gray clouds as Sarah woke to the sound of children's voices echoing through the building. The temperature had dropped even further during the night, and frost covered the inside of her bedroom window in delicate patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. She dressed quickly in layers, her breath visible in small puffs as she prepared for another day of managing an impossible situation. The old floorboards creaked under her feet as she made her way downstairs, where Margaret was already in the kitchen, trying to coax warmth from the temperamental stove. "Morning, love," Margaret called softly, her voice carrying the weariness they all felt. "I managed to get some porridge going, but the milk's nearly frozen solid. We'll need to make it last." Sarah nodded, accepting the steaming cup of weak coffee that Margaret handed her. Through the kitchen window, she could see the children in the backyard, their breath creating small clouds as they built a snowman with the fresh powder that had fallen overnight. Their laughter rang clear in the cold air, a sound that never failed to lift her spirits even in the darkest moments. Tommy came running through the back door, his cheeks red from cold and excitement. "Miss Sarah, we made a snow family. Come see." Despite everything, Sarah smiled and followed him outside. The children had indeed created an entire snow family, complete with button eyes made from small rocks and stick arms that seemed to wave in greeting. Beside the larger figures stood a small snow child, carefully crafted by tiny hands. "That one's for the new kids who might come," explained Lucy, an 8-year-old with pigtails who had been at the home for 2 years. "So they'll know they belong to a family, too." The simple gesture brought tears to Sarah's eyes. These children, who had so little, still thought about others who might need comfort and belonging. Their capacity for love and hope amazed her daily. "It's perfect," she told them, meaning every word. The morning routine continued with everyone pitching in to help. The older children assisted the younger ones with dressing and breakfast, while Margaret stretched the small amount of food as far as possible. Sarah tried to focus on the immediate tasks at hand, but the looming visit from the state inspector next week weighed heavily on her mind. Around 10 o'clock, as Sarah was reviewing their dwindling finances in her office, the sound of a truck engine broke through the usual morning quiet. She looked up from her desk to see an old blue pickup pulling slowly up their long gravel driveway. The truck was well-maintained, but clearly had seen many years of use. In the back, she could make out what appeared to be supplies covered by a heavy tarp. The driver sat tall behind the wheel, wearing a weathered cowboy hat pulled low over his face. Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped onto the front porch as the truck came to a stop near the main entrance. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who immediately commanded attention without saying a word. He was tall and lean, with the kind of presence that spoke of confidence earned through experience rather than bravado. His clothes were simple but well-made, dark jeans, a heavy coat, and boots that had walked many miles. Despite the cold, he moved with an easy grace that suggested he was comfortable in any weather. What struck Sarah most were his eyes, deep brown and kind, with lines around them that could have come from either laughter or squinting into the sun across wide, open spaces. There was something familiar about his face, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and natural. "Name's Jake Morrison. I was wondering if I might have a word with you." His voice was quiet, but carried easily across the space between them. There was no urgency in his tone, but something about his presence suggested that this wasn't a casual visit. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, the director here. How can I help you?" Jake glanced toward the house, then back at her. "I heard you folks might be having a tough time this winter. Wondered if there might be something I could do to help." Sarah felt a mixture of hope and wariness. Offers of help usually came with strings attached, and she'd learned to be cautious about strangers bearing gifts. "That's very kind of you to offer, but I'm not sure what you mean." "Well," Jake said, walking slowly toward the porch but stopping a respectful distance. "I was in town yesterday, picking up some supplies, and I couldn't help but overhear a conversation at the hardware store. Seems your furnace gave out, and winter's settling in pretty hard." Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She hated that their troubles were becoming town gossip, even though she knew people weren't talking out of malice. In a small community, everyone's business became everyone's concern eventually. "We're managing," she said quietly, though the words felt hollow even to her. Jake nodded as if he understood more than she was saying. "I'm sure you are. You got good kids there." I can hear them playing, and happy sounds like that don't come from a place where people aren't managing as best they can. The children had indeed gathered at the windows, curious about their visitor. Sarah could see Tommy's nose pressed against the glass, leaving a small fog circle that he kept wiping away with his sleeve. The thing is, Jake continued, I've got some things in my truck that might be useful. Firewood, for starters, and some other supplies. Nothing fancy, just practical stuff. Mr. Morrison, we appreciate the thought, but we can't accept charity, not charity, he interrupted gently. Call an early Christmas present, or payment for letting an old cowboy remember what it feels like to do something worthwhile. There was something in his tone that stopped Sarah's automatic refusal. She studied his face, looking for any sign of pity or condescension, but found neither. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine respect. Why? She asked simply. Why would you want to help us? Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the snow-covered yard where the children's snow family stood guard. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory. Let's just say I know what it's like to be cold and hungry, and I know what it means when someone shows up at just the right time with just what you need. Before Sarah could respond, the front door burst open and Tommy came running out, followed by several of the other children. They stopped short when they saw the tall stranger, suddenly shy in the presence of someone new. Jake smiled and crouched down at Tommy's level. That's a fine snowman you built there, son. Looks like he's keeping good watch over the place. Tommy's initial shyness melted away. We made a whole family. Want to see? I'd be honored, Jake replied, standing and following the children toward their snow creation. Sarah watched in amazement as this quiet stranger easily engaged with the children, listening to their excited explanations and asking thoughtful questions about their artistic choices. There was nothing forced about his interest. He seemed genuinely delighted by their enthusiasm. Maria appeared at Sarah's side, having observed the scene from the doorway. He seems nice, she said quietly, and look at how the little ones are already talking to him. They're usually scared of new people. It was true. Children had an instinct about adults, and these children, who had more reason than most to be wary, seemed drawn to Jake Morrison like flowers turning toward sunlight. Tell me about the snow child, Jake was saying to Lucy, who beamed with pride as she explained the purpose behind the smallest figure in their snow family. That's for kids who might come here and feel scared, so they know they belong. Jake nodded seriously. That's the kindest thing I've heard in a long time. Shows you understand what family really means. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at Jake and nodded approvingly. That one's got good bones, she murmured to Sarah. My grandmother always said you could tell a person's character by how they talk to children and how children respond to them. After a few more minutes with the Snow family, Jake returned to the porch where Sarah waited. The children followed at a distance, their curiosity overcoming their usual caution around strangers. Now then, Jake said, about those supplies in my truck. Nothing that needs discussion or paperwork. Just some firewood and a few other things that might make the next few days a bit warmer. Mr. Morrison, Jake, he corrected. And before you say no, let me ask you something. If one of those children found someone who needed help, would you want them to walk away because the person was too proud to accept it? The question hit home. Sarah had spent years teaching the children about kindness and helping others. How could she turn away help when it was offered so simply and without conditions? You don't understand the position you're putting me in, she said finally. We're not a charity case. We're a legitimate children's home that's just going through a rough patch. I know exactly what you are, Jake said quietly. You're a place where 15 kids have a chance to be children instead of just survivors. That's worth more than all the money in the world. His words carried such sincerity that Sarah felt her defenses crumbling. How do you know about our situation? Jake shifted slightly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed uncomfortable. Let's just say I make it my business to know when good people are struggling, especially when children are involved. There was more to his story, Sarah realized, something he wasn't ready to share. But looking into his honest eyes and seeing the way the children had responded to him. She found herself trusting this stranger in a way that surprised her. "All right," she said quietly. "We accept your help. But I want you to know that we'll find a way to pay you back somehow." Jake smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face. "The only payment I need is knowing those kids stay warm. Now, why don't we get that firewood unloaded before this snow starts up again?" As if summoned by his words, the first flakes of a new snowfall began drifting down from the gray sky. But for the first time in days, Sarah felt something other than worry about the weather. Help had arrived in the form of a quiet cowboy who asked for nothing in return except the chance to make a difference. The children cheered when Jake lowered the tailgate of his truck, revealing not just firewood, but bags of groceries, warm blankets, and other supplies that would make their immediate future much brighter. But more than the physical gifts, Jake Morrison had brought something even more valuable: hope that they weren't facing their challenges alone. The next 3 days transformed life at Riverside Children's Home in ways that seemed almost magical. Jake Morrison had indeed brought more than firewood and supplies. He brought the kind of steady, quiet competence that solved problems before they became crises. He arrived each morning at 8 o'clock sharp, never making a big production of his presence, just appearing with tools and materials and an apparently endless knowledge of how to fix things. The temperamental furnace, which had been pronounced dead by 2 different repair companies, somehow came back to life under his patient attention. Just needed someone to listen to what it was trying to say, he explained to Tommy, who had appointed himself Jake's shadow and assistant. Machines are like people sometimes. They break down when they feel ignored. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Jake taught the children how to split kindling safely, showing them the proper way to hold an axe and the importance of keeping their feet positioned correctly. His teaching style was patient and thorough, never talking down to them, but treating their questions with the same seriousness he'd give an adult. "He's got away with them," Margaret observed, kneading bread dough that had been made possible by the groceries in Jake's seemingly magical truck. "Haven't seen the children this excited about learning practical things since my own father taught me to cook when I was no bigger than Lucy." It was true. Even the shyest children had begun seeking Jake out, asking him questions about everything from how to tie proper knots to why horses needed shoes. He answered every question thoughtfully, often turning his responses into lessons that somehow made practical skills seem like adventures. But it was during the quiet moments that Sarah found herself most intrigued by their mysterious benefactor. She noticed how he unconsciously checked exits whenever he entered a room, how his eyes constantly scanned for potential problems or dangers. There was something almost military in his awareness, though he moved with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in wide, open spaces. On the 3rd evening, as Jake was preparing to leave for the day, Timothy approached him with the careful steps of a child about to ask for something important. "Mr. Jake," he said in his small voice, "will you tell us a story tonight? Miss Sarah reads to us, but maybe you know different stories." Jake glanced towards Sarah, who nodded her encouragement. "If Miss Sarah doesn't mind sharing story time, I suppose I could tell you about a horse I once knew." The children gathered around the fireplace, which now burned cheerfully with the seasoned wood Jake had provided. He settled into the large chair that had become his unofficial spot, and Timothy immediately climbed into his lap with the trusting nature of a child who had found a safe harbor. "This horse's name was Thunder," Jake began, his voice taking on the rhythm of a natural storyteller, "and he was the smartest horse I ever met. Some folks said he was too smart for his own good, always getting into trouble because he could open gates and untie ropes better than most people." As Jake wove the tale of Thunder's adventures, Sarah found herself studying his profile in the firelight. There was something familiar about the curve of his jaw and the way he gestured when he spoke. A memory tugged at the edge of her consciousness, but she couldn't quite grasp it. "One winter," Jake continued, "Thunder and I got caught in a blizzard up in the mountains. Couldn't see 2 feet in any direction, and the cold was so sharp it felt like needles in your lungs." The children leaned forward, captivated. Even Maria, who usually maintained an air of sophistication beyond her years, was listening with wide eyes. Thunder knew things I didn't, Jake said quietly. He could feel where the safe ground was, even when everything looked the same to me. So I learned to trust him, to follow his lead when my own knowledge wasn't enough. "Did you get out safely?" asked Lucy, her hands clasped together nervously. Jake smiled. "We did, but only because I was smart enough to listen to someone who knew more than I did. Sometimes the best thing you can do is trust others to help you find your way." After the story ended and the children reluctantly headed to bed, Sarah found herself alone with Jake by the dying fire. The comfortable silence between them felt natural, as if they'd known each other much longer than 3 days. "That was a beautiful story," she said. "Is thunder real?" "Real as rain," Jake replied, though I might have left out a few details that weren't quite suitable for young ears. Sarah laughed softly. "I imagine most of your stories have edited versions and full versions. Most lives do, don't they?" Jake's response was quiet, and Sarah sensed they were approaching something important. She took a breath and asked the question that had been growing stronger each day. "Jake, who are you really? I mean, I know your name, but there's more to your story, isn't there?" Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was choosing each one carefully. "You're right. There's more." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "My full name is Jacob Morrison, and until about 5 years ago, I was one of the wealthiest men in 3 states. Sarah felt her breath catch. Jacob Morrison. The name clicked into place now, bringing with it memories of newspaper headlines and business magazines. "Morrison Enterprises," she said softly. "Real estate, construction, energy development." "That's right." Jake's voice held no pride, only a kind of weary acknowledgement. "At one point, I owned more land in Montana than some small countries. Had business interests across the West, political connections, more money than I knew what to do with." "What happened?" Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard where the children's snow family stood sentinel in the moonlight. "I discovered that everything I thought mattered actually didn't matter at all." He turned back to face her, and in the firelight, Sarah could see the pain that lived behind his careful composure. "My wife Elizabeth died in a car accident. We've been fighting that morning, some stupid argument about money and business decisions. The last words I said to her were angry ones." Sarah's heart clenched with sympathy. "I'm so sorry." After the funeral, I kept trying to work, try to pretend that deals and profits and expansion plans could fill the hole she left behind. But sitting in board meetings and making decisions about which mountains to level for mining rights, all I could think about was how none of it had saved her, and none of it meant anything without her to share it with. Jake returned to his chair, but didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind it, his hands gripping the back as if it were an anchor. So I walked away, sold everything, put the money in trusts and foundations, kept just enough to buy a small ranch, and lived simply. I'd spent 20 years building an empire, and it took me about 6 months to dismantle it all. "And now?" Sarah asked gently. "Now I try to pay attention to what actually matters. I raise horses, help neighbors when they need it, and look for places where I can make a real difference instead of just making money." "Like here." Jake nodded. "Like here. When I heard about your situation in town yesterday, I knew this was exactly the kind of place Elizabeth would have wanted me to help. She always said the measure of a person wasn't what they accumulated, but what they gave away when it mattered most." Sarah sat in the warm glow of understanding, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "That's why you knew exactly what we needed, and why you had access to resources so quickly. I've got connections I've maintained with people who do good work. The furnace parts, the groceries, the firewood. I made some calls to suppliers who were happy to help when they understood the situation. But you could have just written a check. Why get personally involved?" Jake's smile was soft but sad. "Because money doesn't keep children warm at night. Presence does. Caring does. Showing up and doing the work alongside people, that's what matters." Sarah thought about the past 3 days, about how Jake had not just brought supplies, but had brought himself. He'd listened to stories, answered questions, taught skills, and made each child feel seen and valued. He'd given them something far more precious than material goods. He'd given them his attention and respect. "The children don't know, do they?" she asked. "About who you were?" "No, and I prefer to keep it that way. They see me as Jake, the guy who's good with tools and tells stories about horses. That's exactly who I want to be." Sarah understood. In a world where children were often valued for what they might become rather than who they were right now, Jake treated them as complete human beings deserving of respect and kindness. His wealth or former status was irrelevant to them, and he seemed to find freedom in that anonymity. "Will you stay?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Jake looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah felt something shift between them, a recognition of possibility that went beyond the immediate crisis of furnaces and food shortages. "For as long as I'm needed," he said quietly. "For as long as I'm welcome." Outside, the wind picked up again, but the house remained warm and secure. The children slept peacefully in their beds, their dreams filled with stories of clever horses and the quiet comfort that came from knowing they were safe and cared for. Sarah looked at this man who had appeared in their lives like an answer to prayers she hadn't quite known how to pray. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The state inspector was still coming, Christmas was still approaching with empty pockets, and 15 children still needed more than any one person could provide. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt like they weren't facing those challenges alone. Help had come not in the form of a distant benefactor writing checks, but in the steady presence of someone who understood that the most important gifts couldn't be bought or sold. They were given freely, person to person, heart to heart, in the quiet moments when one human being chooses to show up for another. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that choice changed everything. The fire burned low, but steady, warming not just the room, but the growing sense that this small family might just survive the winter after all. And perhaps, in the process, they might discover that they'd gained something even more valuable than security. They'd found hope and the beginning of something that looked very much like the answer to a prayer. The state inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and bitter cold. Sarah had been awake since 4, checking and rechecking every room, every safety protocol, every piece of documentation that might determine the future of Riverside Children's Home. Inspector Catherine Webb emerged from her official state vehicle like a general preparing for battle. She was a thin woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a dark coat that seemed designed to intimidate. Her clipboard was thick with forms and checklists, and her expression suggested she'd seen too many facilities that failed to meet standards. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, her voice crisp and professional, "I trust you've prepared for a thorough inspection. I'll need to examine all common areas, dormitories, kitchen facilities, heating systems, and documentation of your current operational status." Sarah's stomach nodded, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Of course, everything is ready for your review." What Inspector Webb couldn't know was that Jake Morrison had spent the previous week quietly ensuring that everything would be more than ready. The furnace now hummed efficiently, providing steady warmth throughout the building. The kitchen gleamed with thorough cleaning, and the children's rooms had been organized with military precision. But more importantly, Jake had worked with the children to help them understand what the inspection meant without frightening them. "The lady coming today just wants to make sure you're safe and happy here," he'd explained during story time the night before. "So just be yourselves, answer her questions honestly, and remember that this is your home." As the inspector began her rounds, Sarah noticed immediately that she was thorough, but not unkind. Webb checked every smoke detector, tested the water temperature, examined the food storage areas with practiced efficiency. Her questions were direct, but not aggressive, and she took careful notes without editorial comments. In the common room, she found the children engaged in quiet activities. Tommy was working on a picture book with Margaret's help, while Lucy and Maria played a board game near the fireplace. The older children were helping the younger ones with simple crafts, and the atmosphere was one of comfortable routine rather than nervous performance. "Children," Inspector Webb said, her voice softer than it had been with Sarah, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about living here. Would that be all right?" The children nodded, and Sarah held her breath as Webb pulled out a different clipboard, one specifically designed for interviewing minors in care facilities. "What's your favorite thing about living here?" she asked Tommy, crouching down to his level. Tommy thought for a moment with the seriousness of a 7-year-old considering an important question. "I like how Miss Sarah reads to us every night, and how Mr. Jake teaches us things, and how Margaret makes cookies when someone's sad." Webb made a note and turned to Lucy. "Do you feel safe here?" "Oh, yes," Lucy said with conviction. "Maria checks on us little kids at night, and Miss Sarah always comes when we have bad dreams. And now that Mr. Jake fixed the heat, we don't have to wear coats inside anymore." Sarah caught the slight surprise in Inspector Webb's expression at the mention of Jake. She made another note and continued her questioning. "Who's Mr. Jake?" she asked Maria, who had emerged as the unofficial spokesperson for the group. "He's our friend who helps fix things and tells really good stories," Maria explained. "He taught us how to split wood safely and how to take care of the horses when he brings them to visit. He's been staying in the guest cottage to help Miss Sarah with all the work around here." This was news to Inspector Webb, and Sarah could see her mental gears shifting. An unregistered adult living on the premises could be a serious violation, depending on the circumstances and his background clearance status. "I see," Webb said carefully. "And how long has Mr. Jake been staying here?" "About a week," said Timothy, who had been quietly coloring at a small table. "He came when it was really cold and brought firewood and food and fixed everything that was broken." Inspector Webb's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could sense the questions forming. As if summoned by their conversation, Jake appeared in the doorway, having just returned from checking on some minor repair work in the utility room. "Inspector Webb," Sarah said, her heart racing, "this is Jake Morrison. He's been volunteering his time to help with some maintenance issues we've been having." Jake approached with his characteristic calm confidence, offering his hand to the inspector. "Ma'am, I hope my presence here isn't causing any problems. I know you have regulations to follow." Webb shook his hand, studying his face with the trained observation of someone who had dealt with many adults in children's facilities. "Mr. Morrison, I'll need to see your background check documentation and understand the terms of your volunteer arrangement." "Of course," Jake replied easily. "I have all the necessary clearances for my previous volunteer work with other youth organizations." Sarah has copies of everything in her files. Sarah's mind raced. Jake had indeed provided all the proper documentation when he'd first begun helping, but she realized now that his thoroughness had been born of experience with institutional requirements rather than luck or coincidence. As Inspector Webb examined the paperwork, Sarah saw her eyebrows rise slightly at Jake's background check results. Whatever she was reading appeared to exceed standard expectations. "This is quite comprehensive," Webb said finally. "Military service, extensive community volunteer work, and financial background checks that go well beyond our usual requirements. I believe in being thorough," Jake said simply. "These children deserve to know that anyone working around them has been properly vetted." The inspection continued through the afternoon, with Webb examining every aspect of the home's operation. She interviewed Margaret about food service protocols, reviewed financial records, and tested emergency procedures. Throughout it all, Jake remained available, but unobtrusive, answering questions when asked, but never inserting himself unnecessarily into the process. It was during the final interview, when Webb sat down with Sarah in her office, that the real test came. "Ms. Mitchell," Webb began, consulting her notes, "I need to understand your current financial situation. The records show some concerning gaps in your operating budget, and there are indications that you've been struggling to meet basic operational costs." Sarah's heart sank. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the point where good intentions and loving care would be measured against cold financial realities. "We've had some challenges," she admitted. The furnace failure put us behind on other expenses, and state funding has been reduced this year. But we're managing, and we've never compromised on the children's care. I can see that, Webb said, and there was something like respect in her tone. The children are clearly thriving, and the facility is well maintained. However, I'm concerned about sustainability. What happens when Mr. Morrison's volunteer time ends? How will you handle the next emergency expense? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Sarah had wondered the same thing herself, lying awake at night, worrying about what would happen when Jake eventually returned to his own life, and they were once again facing challenges alone. Before she could answer, there was a soft knock on the office door. Jake stood there with an envelope in his hand and an expression that was somehow both humble and determined. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I think there's something Inspector Webb should know about." He entered the room and placed the envelope on Sarah's desk. "I didn't want to mention this before because I hoped it wouldn't be necessary, but given the current discussion, I think transparency is important." Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers and found herself looking at legal documents that took her breath away. It was a trust fund establishment, naming Riverside Children's Home as the primary beneficiary, with an initial endowment that would ensure their operational security for decades to come. "What is this?" she whispered. Jake sat down across from her, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. "It's a guarantee that these children will never have to worry about heat or food or basic security again. The Elizabeth Morrison Foundation has been established specifically to support facilities like this one, places where children receive the kind of care that actually makes a difference." Inspector Webb leaned forward, her professional interest clearly piqued. "Elizabeth Morrison Foundation? Named after my late wife?" Jake explained simply. "She always believed that children's welfare should never depend on the economic winds or political changes. This ensures that it doesn't." Sarah stared at the documents, understanding flooding through her. "You planned this from the beginning." "I hoped it wouldn't be necessary," Jake said honestly. "I hoped that by fixing the immediate problems and providing some stability, you'd be able to get back on your feet without major intervention. But watching you work, seeing what you've built here, I realize this place deserves more than just survival. It deserves security." Inspector Webb was examining the trust documents with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many financial arrangements in her work. "This is extraordinarily generous, Mr. Morrison, and legally sound. The terms ensure that funds can only be used for direct care expenses and facility maintenance." "That was intentional," Jake said. "This isn't about creating luxury or dependence. It's about providing the foundation that allows people like Sarah to focus on what they do best, caring for children who need it most." Sarah felt tears threatening to overwhelm her composure. "Jake, I can't accept something this enormous." "You're not accepting it," Jake said gently. "The children are, and they deserve every bit of security this can provide." Inspector Webb closed her folder and looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, based on my inspection today, I'm prepared to recommend continued licensing for Riverside Children's Home. The children are clearly receiving excellent care, your staff is competent and dedicated, and now your financial foundation is secure." She paused and allowed herself a small smile. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've rarely seen a facility where children are so genuinely content and well-adjusted. Whatever you're doing here, keep doing it." As Inspector Webb packed up her materials and prepared to leave, she turned back to Jake with a curious expression. "Mr. Morrison, may I ask what motivated you to establish such a substantial foundation?" Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out the window where the children were playing in the afternoon snow. "I spent most of my life accumulating things that didn't matter. My wife taught me that the only thing that really counts is taking care of each other. This is just my way of making sure that lesson doesn't die with me." After Inspector Webb left, Sarah sat in her office, surrounded by legal documents that had just transformed their entire future. The immediate crisis was over, the long-term security was established, and yet she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Jake appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, settling into the chair across from her with the easy comfort of someone who belonged there. "You could have told me," she said finally. "I wanted to make sure you wanted the help for the right reasons. Not because of what I could provide financially, but because we worked well together and because you trusted me with the children." Sarah understood. He needed to know that his presence was valued for who he was, not what he owned. "And now? Now we plan for Christmas," Jake said with a smile. "Because 15 children are expecting something magical, and I have some ideas about how to make that happen." Outside, the children's laughter echoed across the snowy yard, and inside the building, the furnace hummed quietly, providing the kind of steady warmth that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love. The test was over, and they had passed with flying colors. Christmas morning arrived with a silence that only fresh snow could bring. Sarah woke before dawn, as had become her habit, but this time it wasn't worry that pulled her from sleep. It was anticipation. For the first time in years, Christmas held the promise of magic rather than the weight of impossibility. Outside her window, the world looked like something from a storybook. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, transforming the familiar landscape into a wonderland of gentle curves and sparkling surfaces. The bare trees wore coats of white, and the children's snow family from weeks ago had been refreshed and renewed by nature's own hand. Sarah dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, expecting to find the building still wrapped in the quiet of early morning. Instead, she discovered that someone had been awake even earlier than she had. The common room glowed with warm light from the fireplace, and the scent of coffee and fresh baking filled the air. In the kitchen, she found Margaret and Jake working together with the practiced coordination of people who had found their rhythm. Margaret was pulling golden cinnamon rolls from the oven, while Jake arranged gifts around the Christmas tree that had appeared as if by magic 3 days earlier. "Morning, love," Margaret called softly, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "Look at this beautiful sight we've got to greet the day." The tree stood 8 feet tall in the corner of the common room, decorated with handmade ornaments that the children had crafted over the past weeks under Jake's patient guidance. But beneath its branches lay a sight that took Sarah's breath away. Presents wrapped in colorful paper, each one carefully labeled with a child's name. "Jake," she whispered, "how did you manage all this?" He straightened from arranging the final gifts and turned to her with a smile that held all the warmth of the season. "Magic," he said simply. "The kind that happens when people who care about children decide to make dreams come true." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of excited voices echoed from the stairway. The children had awakened and discovered that Christmas morning had indeed arrived. They came tumbling down the stairs in their pajamas and robes, their eyes wide with wonder at the transformed room. Tommy stopped so suddenly at the bottom of the stairs that Lucy bumped into him from behind. "Is this real?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "As real as love can make it," Jake replied, settling into his favorite chair and watching the children's faces with obvious delight. What followed was the kind of Christmas morning that lived in dreams and memories. Each child found gifts chosen specifically for them. Not expensive toys, but thoughtful presents that showed someone had paid attention to their individual interests and needs. Maria unwrapped a beautiful journal with a leather cover and her name embossed in gold letters. "For all the stories you tell the younger children," Jake explained, "and for any stories you might want to write down for yourself." Tommy discovered a set of building blocks and toy trucks that would let him construct the elaborate roads and buildings that lived in his imagination. Lucy found art supplies and a wooden easel perfect for her size, while Timothy unwrapped a stuffed horse that looked remarkably like the thunder from Jake's stories. Each gift came with a small card explaining why it had been chosen specifically for that child. The personal attention behind every present was clear, and Sarah realized that Jake had spent weeks observing and listening, learning what would bring joy to each young heart. But the children had surprises of their own. Under Margaret's secret guidance, they had created gifts for the adults who had become their family. Sarah received a hand-sewn bookmark decorated with each child's handprint and the words "Best Miss Sarah Ever" written in crayon. Margaret opened a small photo album filled with pictures the children had drawn of their favorite memories together. And for Jake, they presented something that brought tears to his eyes, a wooden sign they had painted together that read Jake's Place, with small handprints around the border in different colors. "For your cottage," Maria explained seriously, "so you'll always know you belong here with us." Jake accepted the gift with the kind of reverence usually reserved for priceless treasures. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. After the gift exchange, the morning continued with Margaret's famous Christmas breakfast. The cinnamon rolls, scrambled eggs that somehow tasted better than usual, crispy bacon, and hot chocolate topped with marshmallows that the children had carefully counted out to ensure equal distribution. As they all gathered around the long table, Sarah looked at the faces around her and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. These children, who had started life with so little, who had faced loss and disappointment and uncertainty, were radiant with joy and contentment. "Should we say what we're thankful for?" suggested Lucy, a tradition they had maintained even during the difficult times. One by one, the children shared their gratitude. They spoke of warm beds and full stomachs, of friends who felt like siblings, of adults who listened to their stories and helped with their nightmares. They mentioned the security of knowing they had a place where they belonged and the excitement of having learned new skills like splitting wood and tying knots. When it came to Timothy's turn, he looked directly at Jake with his serious 5-year-old eyes. "I'm thankful that Mr. Jake came when we were cold, and that he tells stories about horses, and that he makes everything feel safe." Margaret wiped her eyes with her apron when her turn came. "I'm thankful for children who remind an old woman that there's still magic in this world, and for friends who show up when they're needed most." Sarah found her voice catching as she tried to express the fullness in her heart. "I'm thankful for all of you, for second chances, and for discovering that miracles sometimes come disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things." All eyes turned to Jake, who sat quietly for a moment before speaking. "I'm thankful for learning that home isn't a place you own, but people you love, and for discovering that the best gifts aren't things you can buy, but moments you get to share with people who matter." After breakfast, the children scattered to play with their new gifts, and the adults settled by the fireplace with coffee and the comfortable silence that comes after a perfect morning. Snow continued to fall outside the windows, creating a private world where time seemed to move more slowly. "It's funny," Sarah said, watching Tommy show his new trucks to the other children. "A month ago, I was terrified we wouldn't make it through the winter. And now, Jake prompted gently. "Now I can't imagine how we ever managed without you." She turned to look at him, this man who had arrived like an answer to prayers she hadn't known how to pray. "What happens now? Do you stay? Do you go back to your ranch? Do we just pretend this whole thing was a nice interlude?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from child to child, taking in the scene of contentment and security that surrounded them. "What would you like to happen?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm, but she had learned from the children that honesty was often the most direct path to what you needed. "I'd like you to stay, not just as a volunteer or a benefactor, but as part of our family. We work well together, the children adore you, and I—" She paused, searching for the right words to express feelings that had grown gradually, but surely over the past weeks. "I think I've fallen in love with you," she finished quietly. "Not because of what you've given us, but because of who you are. Because you see these children the way they deserve to be seen. Because you show up when things are difficult. Because you make ordinary moments feel special." Jake's smile started slowly, but grew to illuminate his entire face. "I was hoping you'd say something like that. Because I fell in love with you the first day I was here, watching you comfort Timothy while worrying about 15 different problems and still managing to make everyone feel like the most important person in the world." He reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady. "I'd like to stay, if you'll have me." not as a visitor or a helper, but as a partner in taking care of this remarkable family we've built. Margaret appeared in the doorway just in time to hear the last exchange, and her face broke into a grin that could have powered the Christmas lights. Well, it's about time you two figure that out. Even the children have been wondering when you'd stop dancing around each other. As if summoned by her words, the children began gathering around them, sensing that something important was happening. Maria looked from Sarah to Jake, and back again with the knowing expression of a 12-year-old who understood more than adults often gave her credit for. "Are you going to get married and make this official?" she asked with characteristic directness. Sarah and Jake looked at each other and burst into laughter. "Maybe we should take things one step at a time," Sarah said gently. "But Mr. Jake is staying, right?" Tommy asked anxiously. "He's not going back to just his ranch." "I'm staying," Jake confirmed, and the cheer that went up from the children could probably be heard 3 counties away. As the day progressed, filled with games and stories and the kind of easy togetherness that marked the best holidays, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with crisis and desperation, with cold rooms and empty pantries and the fear that everything they'd built was crumbling. But sometimes she realized the things that looked like endings were actually beginnings in disguise. Sometimes help arrived in the form of a quiet stranger who brought more than supplies, who brought hope and partnership and the promise of a shared future. That evening, as the children reluctantly headed to bed after a day that had exceeded their wildest expectations, Sarah and Jake stood together by the Christmas tree. The fire had burned low, and the lights on the tree cast gentle colors across the room where so much had changed in such a short time. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked. "The business empire, the power, the wealth?" Jake considered the question seriously. "I miss Elizabeth every day. But the rest of it? Not for a minute." "This is wealth," he said, gesturing toward the stairway where the children's voices could still be heard as they shared the day's excitement with each other. "This is power, the ability to change lives for the better. And this," he said, pulling Sarah close, "is success." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in peaceful silence. Inside, 15 children slept securely in warm beds, their dreams filled with the magic of Christmas morning and the comfort of knowing they were loved and wanted and safe. In her own room, Sarah fell asleep with Jake's gift to her resting on the nightstand. A simple silver locket containing a picture of all of them together, taken just that afternoon when Margaret had insisted on capturing the moment. On the back, in Jake's careful handwriting, were the words, "Home is where love lives." The Thanksgiving fire that had grown cold just a month ago had been replaced by something warmer and more enduring, the steady flame of love that burned in the hearts of family that had been brought together by need and sealed by choice. It was the kind of fire that would never grow cold, the kind of warmth that would last through all the winters to come. And in the quiet cottage behind the main house, Jake Morrison hung his new sign by the door and smiled. He had found his way home at last. Not to a place, but to the people who had taught him that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars and cents, but in moments of connection, in children's laughter, in the simple miracle of showing up for each other when it mattered most. The haul of warmth he had brought that cold November day had been returned to him 100-fold, proving once again that the best gifts were always the ones that multiplied when they were shared.